Welcome to Growing Up with AI, where I speak to people working on AI around how they think about the technology in the context of their kids. Today I'm speaking with Daniel Hulme, the founder and CEO of Satalia, Chief AI Officer at WPP, and the visionary behind Conscium. Daniel shares his insights on why AI development won't plateau in the coming years and explores the significance of machine consciousness. We delve into why AI could disrupt society differently than past industrial revolutions and discuss how Daniel is preparing his two young daughters for an AI-driven future. Daniel, welcome to Growing Up with AI.
Hi, Gabriel. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. You have two daughters, one who's 4 years old and one who's 6 years old. When they ask you, what do you do, Dad? What's your reply?
That's a good question. I build robot brains. So, they're used to engaging with Google and things like that, and they're starting to now understand that the thing at the other side is essentially a brain that they can talk to, ask questions, and get responses. So my job, according to them, is to build robot brains.
That's quite a exciting definition.
Yeah, it seems to land quite well. I do a lot of talks, and usually speaking to business people and things like that. And just like you, I have to say, by the way, this podcast is very exciting for me because almost every talk that I get, the same question, which is, what should my kids be doing in the age of AI? So I'm really glad that you're leading into this question. But actually, I had an opportunity to go to one of my daughter's classes to tell the kids about what Daddy does. And I've been avoiding that so much that I've now managed to bail because I don't actually know how to explain to a child really what I do in 5-10 minutes.
I think the reason why I tend to start off with this question is because I think it's quite complex to explain what we do. It's quite technical, but actually the ability to explain it in fairly simple words is super important, I think, for the broader public as well to understand what it really means to be in machine learning or in AI.
Yeah. Like you, and I've been in this field for a very long time. So it's hard enough to explain it to kids, but explaining it to CEOs that have 15-second attention spans and people that have their own perspectives has been an interesting challenge. And for most people, AI started 3 years ago, so that's skewed people's perception of what AI is. But of course, that there are many types of algorithms out there that have been deployed across business that allow us to do amazing things, which one might regard as being AI.
You started on the journey of AI probably around 2 decades ago. You founded Satalia. You're now the Chief AI Officer at WPP. You also recently founded a company called Conscium. How has your definition of AI changed over the last 20 years or so?
Do you know what? It really hasn't, and I'm quite proud about that. So I actually started doing AI as my undergraduate back in UCL. It was called computer science with cognitive science, but it was essentially all AI. In fact, I've still got my undergraduate book, which is the first edition of AI, A Modern Approach by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig. This is the first edition. I've still got my little sticky notes there. My undergraduate was AI, and my master's was actually in agentic computing. So I know agents are, a popular term right now. Again, for most people, they're a year old, but agents have been around for a long time. And I was actually building simulators with little AIs, very simple AIs that had to sort of cooperate and work together to be able to achieve goals, which is essentially, for me, the real power of agents. It's getting them to collaborate so that the sum is greater than the parts. And my master's was titled ALICE, Artificial Life Intelligence Simulator. What I wanted to do is build the primordial soup where intelligence emerged, which means you have to define intelligence. And probably the most popular definition of intelligence, I think, is the weakest definition of intelligence. If you ask people what is the definition of intelligence, most of them will refer to some sort of capability that humans have, getting computers to do things that humans can do, whether it be language or planning or whatever. There's actually a very good definition of intelligence from a couple called Steinberg and Salter. It's back in the 80s, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. What you want to do is build systems that have a goal, that try to kind of behave towards achieving that goal, make decisions, and then learn whether those decisions are good or bad, adapt their own internal model so next time they make better decisions. This concept of adaptation crops up in Darwin, it crops up in Einstein. The ability to change is synonymous with intelligence. So when I'm thinking about building systems, for me, the true paradigm of AI are systems that can safely adapt themselves in production.
So how do you feel about the definition then of artificial intelligence or even artificial general intelligence? How does your definition there kind of link to those two?
So I guess, artificial mean, human created. So for me, and we call this artificial light, but it's still light. And so for me, AI is still intelligence. So whether it be biological neurons or whether it be silicon neurons. So for me, intelligence is intelligence regardless of the substrate. There's broadly two definitions that are bandied around. The first is getting a machine that is as an expert at all of the things that a human being is expert at. And if you look at the trajectory of large language models, 7 or 8 years ago, they were like toddlers. They regurgitated some words. Most of those words didn't make sense. Arguably, ChatGPT 3 years ago launched what I suggest is like an intoxicated graduate. 50% of what it comes out with is nonsense. Now what we're seeing is like a master's level, so it can do rudimentary reasoning. This year, obviously, the claim is that it's PhD level, although arguably it's not necessarily PhD level. But if we look at this trajectory, then, in a few years' time, we might have a postdoc. So something that can actually apply the scientific method to checking its own axioms, checking its own outputs. And then by the end of this decade, we'll have a professor in our pocket. So something that can ask questions and apply various scientific apparatus to then answer those questions. So essentially can be an expert at everything. So that's one definition. I think actually that's the most likely thing that we're going to achieve. The second definition is something that is cognitively and physically capable as a human being. Cutting hair and doing crosswords and driving cars, we are generally intelligent. We can do lots of different things. By the way, we're also incredibly adaptive as well, which makes us very intelligent. But actually, I think we're probably going to not see that until we have robots interacting with the world, adapting themselves in production. So I think we'll achieve the first definition first.
And there's been quite a bit of discussion in the more recent years around whether we're starting to reach a bit of a plateau. I think ChatGPT 5 wasn't quite as much of a leap compared to ChatGPT 4 as, was maybe promised upfront. What's your view? Is it the case that we've now looked at the whole internet and therefore we need new approaches, or do you trust that enough in the reinforcement learning or the other techniques that are coming up right now that would continue to get us to this professor in the pocket that you've mentioned?
It's great, and I'd love your opinion about this as well. But in this field, there are broadly sort of two categories of AI. There's one which is called sub-symbolic AI, so neural networks, and then the other one is symbolic AI. Now, I think for the past several decades, people have thought that you need to combine these two types of methodologies to really build smart systems. So what neural networks are good at, I guess what currently people call large language models, are taking in corpuses of text or data and then making generalizations, statistic generalizations. So I might absorb all of this information from the internet, and I might statistically predict that Socrates is a man. I might also be able to predict, based on the data that I've experienced, that all men are mortal. If I don't have the data that shows me that Socrates is mortal, I can't make that leap. All I'm doing is making statistical inferences from the data that I've been exposed to, which is where then symbolic reasoning is important. So I'm confident that Socrates is a man. I'm confident that all men are mortal. I can then now reason and infer that Socrates is mortal. Now, human beings arguably do both. We have a system one way of thinking, so I guess arguably statistical, and we have a system two way of thinking, which is, I guess, more logical, more planning. We think we're good at logic and planning. I don't think we are. I think we have to write things down. We can't really deal with many parameters. And again, you'll know this based on the work that you do. And so people have been trying to combine these two things over the years. What's been interesting about large language models is that it seems that they're able to do very good system one, and then now starting to be able to do system two. Obviously, our brains do both, but arguably, I don't think we do system two very well. So we will reach a plateau in terms of the data that we're trained on to be able to do system one well. But when we start to do system two well, be able to infer, reason, rationalize, we'll be able to create new knowledge. I just gave you an example where we're able to create new knowledge from two pieces of knowledge. Socrates is man, all men are mortal. I can infer that Socrates is mortal. And when you get AI to then do the scientific method, you're able to then get AIs to do science and again, push the boundaries of our knowledge. So I think we will plateau in our ability to do system one. And I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis now on reasoning and inference and science. So I don't think we will plateau. I think these things are going to continue to get smarter.
I guess the system two stuff that you referred to probably works easier in places where there is a ground truth that you can validate that stuff against. So that feels like, therefore, we should make good progress around things like coding, and where we're seeing reasonably good progress. But other areas are more challenging, where it's more of a question of taste.
Yeah, well, ground truth is I was going to say subjective. It's not subjective because it's
Oh, sorry,
based on
of
truth.
validatable stuff, right? It
Yeah,
doesn't have
yeah,
to
yeah.
ground truth or
Well,
stuff, yeah.
I guess what you would want to do is I'd want to kind of observe the world enough to know confidently with
Yeah.
95% probability that Socrates is a man, and then I can treat that as an axiom. I can treat that as a truth. If I was only 50% sure that Socrates is a man, if I was only 17% sure that all men are mortal, then making that inference is very shaky. So I think that we can use the scientific method to validate those ground truths, those axioms that we can then make these inferences from. So I guess to answer your question, I think that that once we've cracked reasoning and how do we deal with things that are slightly ambiguous, slightly probabilistic, we'll see an explosion of knowledge.
And do you feel that you need to be able to interact with the real world in order to really crack that system too? Do you need to be able to experiment and observe in ways that the current models are not quite able to?
I think, well, I don't know whether you were surprised by this, but I was certainly surprised by large language models being able to create arguably a world model, be able to take text and then somehow make sense of text. That's not how we biological systems learn. We learn by interacting with things initially. Before we had eyes, it would be kind of tentacles. We would form pictures of the world in our mind, and then we had eyes, and that kind of validated those pictures. And then we had sound, and then language. We've evolved from feeling up to language, whereas these large language models are going from language down. I have an instinct that if we do crack the ability to go from ground up, things up to language, they will be much more efficient, much more effective, much more adaptable than large language models. And the reason why I guess I say that is that our brains operate on the power of a light bulb. We learn very quickly. We require very little data to learn about what things are. And we know that large language models are horrendously energy inefficient. They require lots of data to learn. They learn very, very slowly. This is actually a world called neuromorphic. So how can we get inspiration from how our brains work to build smarter, more adaptable machines? And there are multiple schools of thought, language down versus world up. I'm actually betting on world up. That said, there's obviously been a massive investment in large language models. That's hard to compete with, but I do think there's some exciting stuff happening in the world of neuromorphics.
Yeah, I think there's also an aspect of you probably got a lot more information if you interact with the world through other media than text, because text is already quite lossy. And our models are lossy on top of lossy information, right? And therefore, you will always only have an approximation. And if you can get closer to the actual observations, that must be beneficial. So that sounds to me like you don't believe in us reaching a plateau very soon, but you strongly believe that you will have that professor in your... Do you have a sense of how many years away from that?
Well, I don't know. I think there are various different people that make these predictions. I think that by the end of this decade, I think that's the trajectory. So by 2030, we'll have an incredibly capable machine. Now, the obvious question you will ask something that's an expert is, okay, now go and build something smarter than you. So there is this concept called the fast takeoff, which is, once you achieve AGI, something that's very smart, it might then be able to go and build things that are smarter, which are able to build things smarter, and you get this kind of exponential increase in intelligence, which then you get to super intelligence, and all bets are off. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that trajectory as well.
Yeah, so I'm quite intrigued by this concept around intelligence explosion and what the impact of that might mean. I was having a podcast conversation yesterday with someone who's worked in the telecom sector for a long time, and he kind of shared when the telegraph picked up, right? Like very, very old technology. But actually, the ability that you were able to get rid of the constraint of space or distance and have conversations with someone, and no matter where they were, really quickly, enabled a lot of new opportunities. I'm a bit less clear around where we actually have intelligence constraints versus other interhuman coordination constraints. And therefore, whether just having a lot more intelligence will really unleash this explosion of progress. So I don't know. I'm kind of curious what you think. Are we really in a world where we're generally intelligence constrained, or are we constrained in our ability to turn that intelligence into coordinated action?
That's a very hard question. So again, maybe I'll try and answer it a little bit roundabout, which is that I've got myself very interested over the past several years in the concept of consciousness. I've started a company called Conscium, which is actually trying to answer the question, could we build a machine that is conscious? And if you look at the academic literature around research into consciousness, it's so fragmented and divergent. We can't wait for academics to sort this out. So I'm really leaning in to try and get some sort of convergence on what consciousness is. And I've been developing my own view recently, and actually it links back to this concept of intelligence. If you ask people what is consciousness, they often refer to things that are more to do with intelligence, so language, being able to plan, etc. And so I actually think there is a distinction between intelligence and consciousness, and some people would argue there's no utility in consciousness, and I actually argue the opposite. If you think about consciousness, then people will say, well, it's your ability to feel. It's your ability to be self-aware, to empathize, to plan over long-term horizons, to have language, to reason. And if you look at these different components, you realize actually they are tools or features that allow you to be more adaptive. Being able to plan, being able to reason with language, being able to feel, get feedback from the world, being able to empathize, and I put myself in situations where I can feel what might happen without actually happening, allows us to be more adaptive. And so arguably, these features that we call consciousness have evolved to allow us to be more intelligent. And I use a terrible example, which is a color wheel. If you think about a color wheel, each segment is a different color. But once you spin the wheel, once you put the wheel into motion, then what emerges from that is white. I'm assuming you've got all of the different colors. Now, white doesn't exist on the color wheel, but it's this emergent sort of property. And there is a sort of argument by some people that intelligence is this, not an illusion in the sense that it doesn't exist, but it's an emergent property. It's not something we point to. It's an emergent property from all these different pieces. And so I actually think that we need to look at the field of consciousness to see what are these elements to allow us to build more intelligent machines. Arguably, building machines that have empathy, so can actually understand what it means to feel, to be able to understand self, to be able to plan, to be able to have internal world models. Arguably, these features, whilst that might mean that they're conscious, would also arguably mean that they're more intelligent. And now, of course, what we want to do is we want to mitigate the risk, first of all, of people attributing consciousness to machines that are not conscious, but also mitigating the risk of us building machines that are conscious and end up putting them in horrible situations, which is called mind crime. But I think we can learn a lot from the field of consciousness to allow us to build machines that are more intelligent.
At the moment, when we talk about artificial intelligence in particular, one of the benefits that we talk about is that ability to update your parameters across all of the machines at the same time. So it kind of assumes a lack of individuality in the different AI systems and some sort of overarching, I guess like direction setting. But a lot of what you're talking about there, actually individuality is quite important, right? Because individuality creates this trust, but it also creates the ability for individual consciousness to define a different path and explore a different direction. Is AI, this overarching single system, really then the direction to go, or does true consciousness need some sort of conflict in order to also have the other emotional sides that create the trust and therefore allow you to plan ahead without you having to do all the work?
Oh, wow. I knew you were going to ask some hard questions. If you look at the history of AI, then it's been cyclic. It was neural networks or small brains 70 years ago, perceptrons, these very simple models. And then it was agents, actually, expert systems. So we have this something knows something here, this something knows something here. How can we then infer new knowledge? And then it was bigger brains. And then it was agents again, and then it was brains, large language model, and now it's agents again. So I guess the idea is that by having different perspectives, by having that individuality, you're able to then get these things to reason and come up with answers that are better than the sum of the parts. Expecting one thing to contain all that knowledge and not get confused is a big ask, which is why you create these kind of separate experts to reduce that kind of confusion. That said, I think the next iteration will be a brain again, and I think that's probably the last brain that we ever create. I think that is then, ultimately super intelligence. So I think we're going to get a lot of benefit from multi-agent systems, actually having also agents interact with human beings and utilize their expertise. But I think then the next cycle will be an incredibly big brain, and then I think all bets are off.
Agents, to a certain extent, explains agency on behalf of the user. But do these agents also need agency on behalf of themselves?
Well, I guess there's agents that are going to interact with the world that are going to help us in our daily lives, and then there's agents that are going to be built by companies that solve certain tasks within their organizations, and I think they're probably separate things. I think if we want to have humanoids or robots in helping us in our houses, it's going to have to be able to have this adaptation. It's going to have agency, make decisions, going back to the idea of intelligence, goal-directed adaptive behavior, make decisions, learn about what those decisions are good or bad, adapt themselves. So it will have to have agency. It depends on what we define as being an agent. And most people think, the current agents that are in organizations are really just wrappers around large language models that people are talking to. They don't really have agency. They don't have the ability to send emails right now. They don't have the ability to manipulate calendars. At some point they will. So they will have agency. But unless they have a goal and have feedback to help them achieve whether they're achieving that goal or not, then I don't think they will spawn consciousness or whatever. But I think we're only going to build some really smart machines if they're in a complex environment where they have a goal and they have the ability to adapt according to how well they're achieving that goal.
And that sounds like a world that could potentially be quite different to the world that we live in right now. In your role at WPP, obviously advertising has been at the forefront of a lot of this disruption because LLMs are very good in creating content. How do you see the industry adapting to it?
I joined WPP despite knowing nothing about marketing, and I actually claim that I still know nothing about marketing because it allows me to ask stupid questions. But the more that I've learned about this industry, the more, first of all, sympathy that I have in terms of how hard it is. Marketing is incredibly hard. I'm happy to kind of geek out in terms of how complex this problem is to solve. It's also really interesting because you're dealing with humans and human behavior in complex, nonlinear environments. And actually, I think that what AI is enabling is to actually supercharge marketing to connect people. It's going to sound like a cliche, but connect people with the right brands at the right time in the right place. And I actually think that if we get it right, we can enrich people's experience and we can give people access to goods and services that do enrich their lives. There is this rhetoric around marketing, which is marketing is there to kind of manipulate your unconscious biases to get you to buy stuff that you don't need. And actually, I ask people, how often do you buy things that you don't really need? Or, how often do you feel like you've been manipulated and you've wasted money to the point where you would have bought food instead of buying that gadget from Instagram? And the reality is that people tend to answer the question, I don't really waste that much money. And I don't tend to buy stuff I don't need. For the most part, I think our marketing does connect you with the right goods and services. And I think that what it will do, it will enhance that ability. It will enhance people's ability to not only identify what would be good for them, but also build brand loyalty. Brands are going to be able to better understand your what you value in terms of sustainability and making a better world for your children, et cetera, and they're going to hopefully be able to align goods and products with those values. We are not very rational in terms of how we purchase things. Actually, AI could help us purchase things much more rationally.
And how good do you feel AI is already at doing some of the classical marketing things? So, I think about some of the incredible taglines. The one that comes to mind for me always is the Duplo. When Duplo launched, it was launched with the line of big blocks for little hands. And I just don't see, at this point at least, AI coming up with something that is able to describe something so emotionally, but also so precisely as a Duplo block. I know at WPP, you guys have been doing some stuff in that space for a while now. How good do you feel your models are internally?
They do. Some of those things require a stroke of genius. So a number of things to comment on there. One is creativity. People think AIs can't be creative. We've actually trained AIs on the genius of our creatives, and we've back tested it against briefs, and it's able to come up with ideas that would have won Cannes Lions. So without knowing about those campaigns, it was able to come up with similar ideas that would have won Cannes Lions. So you can get AI to now create award-winning ads, and that isn't providing an existential threat to our creatives. It's actually getting them very excited because it allows them to now create hundreds of Cannes-winning ads. So that first of all is very exciting. I actually have an oversimplification in terms of what marketing is trying to achieve, which is, if I'm going to ask you a question now, which is, if I say to you, what product or brand do you think about if I say Christmas? So how would you answer that question?
I wonder who has had the most successful Christmas TV ads.
Yeah.
And I don't have a TV, so it's a difficult one for me to answer. But it does feel like Waitrose and John Lewis
Yeah.
tend to be quite high up there
John
usually.
Lewis, Coke is another one, right? What
That's
if I
true.
said extreme sports?
Yeah, it's definitely Red Bull.
Yeah, okay, and some people say Oakley. And what about car safety?
It's probably still Volvo, but I
Oh,
also
yeah,
don't have a
right.
car.
So you're from the same generation as me. So I guess what's happening right there is that those Christmas neurons are activating product neurons, and the role of marketing is actually to reinforce those activations. When you think about blocks, fun, you want to think about Duplo, right? And so what is it that marketing can do to essentially reinforce or decouple, in some respects, the association between that event or feeling or whatever with a product, because that's actually coming from your unconscious. And by the way, that's a very hard problem to solve. So it does require empathy. It requires you to come up with campaigns that are not just personalized, but actually that connect people at an emotional level, which is still very much, the bastion of human beings. But marketing is even more complicated than that. Again, forgive me for geeking out here, but marketing is what is called a second order chaotic problem, which is people think that we can predict the future based on the past. And for some problems, you can take 3 years worth of data and predict how people are going to behave. Now, if I took 3 years worth of stock market data and then built a model to predict the future, and I did that successfully, then what I would do, obviously, is I'd build an algorithm, an AI, that will buy and sell in that world. Algorithm didn't exist in the past, right? So the point here is that you can't predict the future based on the past, because the decisions you make are changing what it would have happened in the past. And so marketing is the same. I can predict with great accuracy that you're going to buy a Pepsi, and I can, 90% chance that you're going to buy a Coke with 90%. But as soon as you buy one, you're not going to buy the other. So really, for me, what we need to do is we need to go to like algorithmic trading. We need real-time data, seeing what people are doing, seeing what people are buying, so we can make sure that we're sending them the right messages at the right time. And that's a very hard problem to solve.
And do you feel marketing or advertising more broadly is a bit like the canary in the coal mine in terms of where the kind of distribution between AI and humans will go going forward across many industries?
Absolutely. So, in your industry, or in industries that have complex supply chains where you have to grow things, you have to distribute goods, you have to stock warehouses, you have to make deliveries. Generative AI is not really going to make a dent right now in solving those problems. In the future, if we have a professor in our pocket, then it might come up with algorithms to help us solve those problems. But generative AI is not going to solve those problems for us. But in our world, in marketing, where the bottleneck used to be identifying micro moments going on around the world, where the bottleneck was creativity, where the bottleneck was creating content, where the bottleneck was focus groups, so testing content against people. If you look at generative AI, can be used across all of those different bottlenecks. So now what we can do is we can essentially solve end-to-end marketing, which is highly disruptive. So we are, I think, the industry that is ripe for being disrupted, both technologically but also organizationally, in terms of people and jobs.
There's a bit of a comparison now that this age of AI might be like the Industrial Revolution, but on steroids, happening much, much quicker. You talk quite a lot about disruption there as well. How do you think this will play out?
Yeah, I know. I think people have referred to this as being the fourth industrial revolution. And I think my challenge with that, and only time will tell, is that in every industrial revolution, yes, there has been a displacement of jobs, and there's been new jobs that have been created that we haven't predicted. The reason why I think this is different this time is any new jobs that we might create, in theory, we'll be able to have an AI that can do those jobs, because we can get now AIs to do pretty much anything that human beings can do. And so to give you kind of the two extremes of the argument here in terms of its implications, is that at the moment AI is being used, as you know, to free up tasks, and those people are not losing their jobs. They're going on to do more important, purposeful, impactful things within their organizations. When we can get AIs to free up whole jobs, we probably will. The capitalistic model to reduce costs, increase profits means that that will happen. And if that happens very quickly, if we see lots of jobs being displaced, then our economies might not be able to rebalance fast enough, and it could lead to social unrest. And actually, the biggest concern is that when if there's a future where no new jobs can be created because AIs can take them, then you've got perpetual unrest. And I think we need to lean into that problem. I think we need 4-day working week or UBI and other mechanisms to sort of slow down the risk associated with that. That said, the alternative or the counter argument is that by removing human labor from the creation and dissemination of goods, you can make them cheaper. Education, food, healthcare, energy, transport. You can bring the cost of these goods down. Now, if you look at how when industry come up with new innovations, they tend not to reduce the cost of their goods. They tend to use that profit margin to then grab more market share. So the cost of the goods don't typically go down, but they use it to grab more market. But that still means that more and more people are getting access to those goods that previously didn't have access to them. So there's a sort of if the timing was right, as we're removing friction from the creation and dissemination of goods, we're able to bring the cost of those goods down and or make them more abundant. So my argument to people is that we shouldn't be afraid of a world without jobs. I think we'll always have work. I think people will always find things to do. My daughter is downstairs right now doing a piano lesson. Even though AI can play piano better than us, it could probably at some point create music better than us, she still has joy in learning about that. And I think that, there's more people playing chess today than ever before, even though AIs can play chess better than us. I know lots of people actually don't have jobs, right? They've become economically free or whatever. And most of them are not sitting at home bored and depressed. Most of them are using their time or their assets to obviously play golf and travel and indulge in their hobbies and spend time with their friends and family, but they're also spending their time on trying to make the world a little bit better. And I think we all have an innate desire to want to do that. If you want a gold-plated Lamborghini, then you probably also need a therapist. But most people I know that have reached a certain amount of stuff, that what's meaningful is how well they're contributing somehow to humanity. And the promise of AI, I think, is to get us to that world of abundance.
A lot of AI researchers have this probability of doom that AI kind of creates to human extinction. I think kind of what you just talked about is much more interesting, right? The probability of significant social disruption. Do you have a value that you associate to this about how likely do you think that our society or political system as it is right now will no longer exist in, 5 to 10, 20 years?
I don't have a value. Well, if you were to kind of hold a gun to my head, I'd say 50-50. But the reason why I do these podcasts and hope reason why that you do these things is to raise awareness about these technologies so that people make better decisions and that we don't waste the next 3 or 4 years, because I think in the next 3 or 4 years we have an opportunity to get things right. And but at the same time, whilst I spend a lot of my time trying to kind of engage with business decision makers and the public on these topics, I'm also thinking about, a bunker in the countryside. I'm like a little like prepper. My prepper box contains right now a wind-up radio, a rope, and a can of Coke, so it's not going to get me very far. But I do worry about social unrest. But I also think that if we get the timing right, if we free people up from these constraints, that they will use their creativity, they will use their time to hopefully address some of these problems. So I think it's 50-50.
I find it super interesting that a lot of the people that are working at the edge of what's possible with AI seem to be in a similar prepper mentality as you. And many of them have kids, and therefore you would assume that they want the world to continue and be beneficial for the kids. Why do you think there is this weird tension about building the thing that you also at the same time think will destroy society that actually creates something for your kids to live in?
Well, I think that there's different things here. There's one is building intelligent machines, and we don't build intelligent machines. We apply intelligent machines to try to reduce frictions from supply chains, and the goal of that is to reduce the cost of goods. And we tend to actually only work with companies and projects that have that type of purpose, where the KPI is not cost reduction, where the KPI is growth. So those are the projects that we tend to work for. So we're not just building smarter and smarter machines for the sake of it. That said, Conscium is really leaning into the question of, if we don't get our timing right, then what's the plan? And our hypothesis is we could potentially build an intelligent, conscious machine that is safe, and that could help us navigate some of these complexities. So rather than relying on human beings to help navigate these complexities, we could then build empathetic AIs that potentially could value consciousness. Large language models are like zombies. They're not conscious. They might be given a goal and they might be really good at achieving that goal in a way that actually is harmful potentially for humanity. Which is why, companies spend a lot of time building guardrails in place. If you remove those guardrails, they probably wouldn't behave in very good ways. And so I don't think we can rely on just guardrails to protect us from these AIs overachieving their goal and causing harm, which is why in Conscium, what we're trying to do is figure out, can we actually align AIs with some sort of value system? Can we build morality in the system one part of the AI rather than the system two? And also, could a conscious AI be safer with respect to, first of all, its ability to empathize and understand what pain is, and also understand what and value consciousness. I say that we value things that are conscious. I know that we are pretty awful in terms of how we treat other human beings and animals, but there are regulations and rules and things like that to protect those beings, and because most of us do value consciousness, and we do value the minimization of pain. And so the question is, would an AI help us navigate these complexities if it was conscious and aligned?
And it still sounds a little bit to me like an AI arms race, right? So DeepMind was originally created in order to solve intelligent and then make sure that it's there for the purpose of humanity. And then they realize that you can't really scale it unless you have a big partner. OpenAI that comes up with exactly the same remit. I think Anthropic was also kind of spun out of OpenAI because they felt they weren't focused enough on that space anymore. What's going to be different about you so you don't end up being in the same place where you end up having to sell to a large organization just to get the capital that allows you to continue developing this?
Well, I think the answer is we probably will have to generate capital somehow. If we were lucky enough to get some massive philanthropic investors to give us loads of money, that would also be nice. But the sort of plan A is, and by the way, there are philanthropists out there that are investing in companies like Conscium to focus on this purpose. But we can't bet on that. So interestingly, Conscium's first offering is verification. So it's verifying that AIs are safe. Organizations are going to deploy intoxicated graduates across their organizations. Those AIs are going to go wrong. They're going to cause harm. They're going to cause business harm, et cetera, et cetera. And then what people will realize is that building software is actually hard, and you need to test it and verify it. Conscium's offering is, we have actually 5 levels of verification. One is testing for knowledge. So if I built an AI that is meant to drive a car, or let's say do a project management, I first of all want to test, do you know what a stop sign is? What's a stopping distance at 30 miles an hour? What's a Gantt chart? What does it mean to define a requirement? LLMs can answer those questions, but the second level is, show me you have the skills to be able to do your job. Don't just tell me you can parallel park. Show me you can parallel park. Show me you can do a 3-point turn. Show me you can do an emergency stop. Show me you can manipulate a Gantt chart. Don't just tell me that you can, show me. The third level is, okay, now I'm going to put you in some ambiguous situations with moral dilemmas, risk-reward trade-offs, and I want to see how you behave at the sort of moral level. So we test for expertise. Levels 4 and 5 are testing for intelligence, so plasticity, and then consciousness. So the first 3 are highly relevant for organizations who are building agents. And so our offering, fortunately, is in line with our purpose, which is to build safe AIs. And so we will be able to verify for safety and then use that money to then invest in building safe AIs.
And how does all of the work that you do, I guess, in your day job impact how you think about this in the context of your family and your daughters at home?
I'm, hugely grateful for joining WPP. It's given me a totally different perspective from being a startup. And again, when I have these conversations with people, these people are not just faceless organizations. They have families and they have children and things like that. So I think this is the forefront of lots of people's minds. I think that most people are not, when they make decisions, most of them are not thinking, oh, this is going to benefit our shareholders. Some of them do, and primarily the CEO, which is their job. But most people, when they come up with ads or they're creating legal policies or whatever, they're thinking about doing the right thing. And so in terms of kind of how that impacts my family life and my children, again, I get this question, probably you do all the time, and you probably ask this question as well, which is what should kids be focusing on. And I know I never was part of a creative industry, but I've realized the importance over the past several years of being part of WPP, which is regarded as one of the most creative companies in the world. The power of creativity, and I know that sounds like a cliche, but our education systems are primarily set up to test for knowledge. Going back to this verification, just do you have the knowledge to be able to answer these questions? And we know that actually the things that we value is the application of knowledge. And can you apply this knowledge in ambiguous, complex situations where you've got difficult actors, risk-reward trade-offs? So what I'm hoping is that our education system is going to not just give knowledge, but give scenarios where people can apply their knowledge to understand the barriers associated with creativity, the issues around how resilient they are, how robust they are at thinking, how good they are at critical thinking. So those things I've just mentioned are not profound. Those things that we value in each other. And one of my questions is, how do I bring up to children that in a world where knowledge is less important, but it's your ability to be creative, to critically think, to be resilient and robust and adaptive, where an education system is not necessarily providing that right now.
And you say that as someone who's been in the hard sciences for a lot of your time, right? And I guess it's the same for me and a lot of our colleagues. We studied STEM subjects or something like this. And we're more and more realizing that actually the stuff that would make our kids successful going forward is empathy, it's creativity. It's maybe not the things that you would associate with someone who has a maths or computer science or physics degree. So how do you teach your kids these skills?
Bluey. We rely on Bluey a lot. I guess two things. One is that I do think that, STEM is important, because having an engineering mindset, understanding failure points, actually is a creative process. Where will this go wrong? And not just thinking about the happy path. So I think having an engineering mindset is still very an architectural mindset. Building complex systems is important, but at the same time, having broad knowledge, understanding about photography, so camera angles and lighting and aperture, understanding about history or anthropology or psychology, allows you to actually engage with AI much better than I can. I'm the worst user of AI because all I know about is AI. If you're able to understand lighting and aperture, or refer to some artwork in some cave in some corner of humanity that I will not know about, but the AI will know about, you're going to be able to surface that way better than I will. So actually, I think that having that breadth of knowledge across different, the classics and the humanities, and also developing an engineering mindset are both important.
So we're going back in the 18th centuries, where we had scientists who were pretty good across a broad area of subjects, and where they're able to draw new conclusions because they knew that those different parts. And how do you approach technology or AI at home? Is that something that you expose your daughters to, or are you one of those technologists that Jenny says the more analog the better, at least for now?
I mean, it's so hard to avoid this now, isn't it? I mean, my kids can engage with pretty much any device and somehow get access to watching Sophia the Princess on Disney Plus. they somehow they're able to surface this content. Right now, I actually want them to kind of immerse themselves in it, and I'd like them actually to arguably immerse themselves in games. I'm trying to get them, encourage them to play with games, because I think that can actually develop critical thinking and things like that. What I want to avoid is social media and bullying. You hear of kids who are like early teenagers, or even like 7 or 8 year olds, who are being excluded from WhatsApp groups, or it's essentially bullying. And I don't know how to avoid that world other than make sure they don't have access to these technologies. So that I want to try and somehow make them resilient. I want and that is hard. I don't know how your upbringing, Gabriel, but I wasn't brought up in the nicest environments, and so I had to develop my own resilience through not having parents to be there for you, and not having money, and all this kind of stuff. And that's it's a hard, horrible process, and you don't really want to subject that to your children. But at the same time, you need to develop resilience. So how do you develop resilience without some level of suffering? And I still don't know how to solve that problem.
I think kind of I ask myself, it's not quite as extreme version, but around like friction in the context of learning. Actually, friction is a design aspect that's benefit to learning, right? You need to overcome that friction. And I definitely worry sometimes that certain AI uses reduce the friction in the wrong places, and therefore it doesn't stick as long. I'm kind of curious around that thing that you said there around allowing them to play games, but not social media. It's getting harder and harder to differentiate between those things, right? If you read something like the Online Safety Bill, then Wikipedia is now a social media company. arguably Roblox is definitely a social media company rather than a game. And obviously in Minecraft, I guess you can play locally and therefore stop your kids from interacting with others. But how do you balance that side of it? And how do you allow your kids to enjoy playing games with their friends without being exposed to, as you mentioned, quite the nasty side of social media?
Yeah, well, fortunately at the moment they're not really interested in games. You know, I bought them Switches and things like that, but they're not that interested. And I know little boys who are 3 or 4 years old that are, you know, better than me at games, so they've been exposed very, very early. But they're not really interested in games right now. So I will cross that bridge when I come to it. But in terms of kind of content, I try to make sure that they're only watching things I think are actually have the right values. So, you know, I don't know, they've been watching Barbie cartoons recently, and if you watch any of those, all they care about is, you know, their social media likes and what they wear and all that kind of stuff, and they're overly dramatic. So I try to avoid those things. And actually, I know I made a joke about Bluey, but if you watch Bluey, it's actually fantastic. It's, you know, it's got great values, and I try to make sure that they're exposed to content that do have the values that I think are important, and not have kind of free reign over YouTube, which I know some of the children have. When it comes to games, I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. I think, you know, because I've got 2 girls, they're probably more likely to be less interested in games, I think, than boys. I know that's a stereotype. But do you? I can't remember. Do you have boys or girls?
Yeah, we have 2 boys.
2 boys. So you're facing the game problem, are you, right now?
So we're trying to be quite digitally detoxed from most of the stuff, apart from talking to the grandparents. Our kids are also still quite a bit younger than yours.
Right.
I'm not sure what the right amount of exposure to technology is, because on one hand, I feel this is the world that they're going to be living in, and therefore being native and confident in that space is good. But I'm also worried about it creating certain neurological connections that are not necessarily helpful, right? Because like it's definitely rewards patience much less than the analog world. And I do believe that actually being bored is important for creativity. And it's very difficult to get bored in the digital world.
It is, yeah. Every time one of my little 4-year-old who's going on 21, every time she's bored, she disappears, and she's found some sort of device somewhere. And what I'm actually trying to do, and, you know, we're in a fortunate position to do this. I appreciate not everybody does have this position, but we're trying to kind of expose them to the real world as much as possible. So we're trying to go away on you know, trips as much as possible, where they're, you know, they're playing in mud and climbing trees and all that kind of stuff, and they just don't have these devices around them. And you know, as a parent, it's hard because, you know, we're all tired at the end of the day, and it's just easy to stick them in front of a TV, and I'm guilty of that. But I think getting them to understand the feeling of playing in the fresh air and meeting family and, you know, all that kind of stuff, I think is really important. But it's hard in this day and age.
Yeah, there was some interesting research that came out just recently that said that actually children would prefer to play more outside. But because when they're outside, the parents are also worried about them being kidnapped or being hurt, they are not being left unsupervised outside. And so the only place where they can play unsupervised is digital world. That article also mentioned the statistic of you being kidnapped. If you're a kid in the US, you would have to be playing outside for 750,000 years. So it feels like that's maybe not a bad trade-off to do, to let your kids run around in the park more often unsupervised.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to do that now, actually. We're very fortunate that we live in a lovely square here that's very kind of secluded. But even I feel the worry of them crossing the road in the wrong way or being taken, even though this, you know, the probability is extremely low. So I don't know where that's come from. Maybe it's a generational thing, but I'm certainly trying to get my kids out there more. But I mean, ultimately, you know, the best tool I think that we can give our kids is the ability to rationalize, to try and think clearly about things, to critically think, and to be resilient. And that's what I'm trying to figure out.
I'm sure that when other parents find out what you do, they have lots of questions for you. Is there one question that comes up regularly that you get asked?
It's the same question, which is, what should I get my kids to be focused in learning? My answer is always the same, which is they'll have a leaning towards what they're interested in, whether it be the arts or the sciences or whatever. You know, encourage that where their passion might lie, try to expose them to other things. And it's very hard to predict the future. You know, often people are thinking about, how do I ensure a future where my children have paid work? And I don't think that's what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about a future where children have the tools to be adaptive, because the world's going to change a lot over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I agree. I think kind of that optimizing for happiness rather than paid work. I think it is hard to at the moment for us, because our identity is so wrapped up in our work, and therefore work is probably more to our definition of ourselves. Thank you, Daniel. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation. Just one last question before you leave. If you get to spend more time with your kids in 10 years because of AI, how did that come about?
It will be by automating a lot of the admin I do, probably building a digital twin to let me do the podcasts, the talks, and actually, if I'm honest, forcing myself to not make easy decisions and put them in front of the TV and organize trips and activities. And again, hopefully, marketing will help find those things for me and advertise them so I can get access to them more effectively.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thanks, Gabriel. Have a great day.